What if a world-famous singer, admired for her grace and talent, was mocked in front of an entire airplane full of strangers? That is exactly what happened to Coco Jones, a woman known not only for her voice, but for her dignity and strength. As she boarded her flight, her heart was set on peace and privacy. Yet one flight attendant decided to turn her into the subject of ridicule. The sting of those words cut deeper than expected, and Coco sat quietly, masking her hurt with calm composure. But what the flight attendant did not realize was that this moment was far from over. Someone else was on that plane, someone who carried far more power than anyone could have imagined. The stage was set, and the question remained: what would happen when the truth finally came to light? Coco Jones had been on the road for weeks. Concerts, interviews, endless meetings. Her schedule had been a whirlwind, and finally, she was on a flight that would take her back home. She stepped into first class with the calm elegance people always associated with her. Her outfit was simple, yet flawless, her presence commanding without her needing to say a word. Even in exhaustion, she carried herself like someone who belonged in every room she entered. As she placed her bag carefully in the overhead compartment and adjusted herself in the wide leather seat, a flight attendant approached. The woman's smile was tight, more forced than warm. Her eyes glanced Coco up and down in a way that felt less professional and more judgmental. "Please make sure your bag is properly stowed. We don't want any issues later," the attendant said, her tone clipped as if Coco were some careless traveler rather than a first-class passenger. Coco nodded politely, offering a small smile, but inside she felt the sting. Other passengers noticed. A man in the seat across from her frowned, tilting his head as if trying to make sense of the exchange. A woman in the row behind leaned forward slightly, sensing tension but staying silent. Some ignored it altogether, buried in their phones or already ordering drinks, but the shift in atmosphere was subtle and undeniable. Something felt off. Minutes later, as Coco settled with her seatbelt fastened, another staff member passed by with a tray of welcome drinks. He offered them graciously to a couple nearby, but glanced at Coco with the faintest smirk before setting the tray down without a word. She waited, assuming he would turn back to include her, but he didn't. The small act of exclusion carried weight. Coco kept her composure, yet the questions began forming in the air. Was this intentional? Was she being singled out? A few passengers exchanged looks. One whispered quietly to another as if confirming they had also picked up on the dismissiveness. Others seemed to notice but looked away quickly, unwilling to get involved. Coco sat tall, hiding her discomfort behind a practiced grace, but there was no mistaking it now. The service she was receiving was different, colder, and the reasoning behind it was unclear. It was only the beginning of the flight, but already the air felt charged, as if something more was about to happen. Why was she being treated this way, and how far would it go before someone finally stepped in? The flight attendant returned with a forced smile, her tone dripping with sarcasm as she asked Coco if she was comfortable enough in her seat. Her words seemed polite on the surface, but her exaggerated expression gave away the mockery beneath. A few passengers caught the exchange, some chuckling softly, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. It was clear something more was brewing. As Coco adjusted her seatbelt, the attendant leaned closer, pretending to check the compartment above, but muttering just loudly enough for those nearby to hear. She questioned if Coco had accidentally wandered into first class, as though she didn't belong there. Coco heard every word, but stayed calm, her posture straight and her face unreadable. The whispers among the passengers grew. A man 2 rows back nudged his companion, pointing discreetly in Coco's direction. Another passenger frowned, clearly unsettled but unwilling to intervene. What was striking was the indifference of the rest of the staff. A second attendant passed by, catching the cruel remark, but instead of addressing it, she smirked, as if in agreement. The dismissal was intentional, a silent reinforcement of the first attendant's arrogance. Coco's silence wasn't weakness, it was a choice. She observed every detail, the way the attendant's voice rose in mock laughter, the passengers' shifting gazes, the refusal of the staff to step in. Inside, her emotions swirled, but outwardly she remained collected. The tension around her was growing thicker by the minute, each small act of humiliation pulling the attention of more passengers. The attendant's next move was bolder. She accidentally spilled a few drops of water while setting Coco's glass on the tray, smirking as though it were clumsiness when it was anything but. Coco looked at her, a steady gaze that lasted longer than expected, and for the first time the attendant faltered, if only for a second. That look carried weight, a silent warning that this woman was far from powerless. The audience watching this unfold in the cabin couldn't know what was coming next, but the signs were there. Coco was not a woman to be underestimated, and soon everyone on board would learn just how wrong it was to treat her with such disrespect. The moment reached its peak when the flight attendant, no longer hiding behind subtle remarks, turned openly cruel. She smirked while standing in the aisle, speaking loudly enough for several rows to hear. With a mocking tone, she asked Coco if she had wandered into the wrong section of the plane, and followed it with an exaggerated laugh. The sound echoed through the cabin, sharp and humiliating. Coco froze for a brief second, her eyes fixed on the woman. Inside, a storm was brewing, shocked that such open disrespect could happen so boldly, anger that simmered under the surface, but also a controlled strength that refused to give the flight attendant the satisfaction of seeing her break. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and met the attendant's stare with unflinching calm. Passengers around them shifted uncomfortably. A man in the row across covered his mouth in disbelief. A woman further back whispered to her neighbor, unable to look away from the unfolding tension. Some glanced nervously at the call button, but none dared to press it. The air grew heavy with discomfort, every second stretching longer than the last. The flight attendant, sensing the eyes of the cabin on her, smirked again and crossed her arms as though she had won some invisible battle. She leaned closer and whispered something sharp just for Coco to hear, a final insult meant to cut deeper. Coco's lips parted slightly, not in protest, but in measured restraint. Her silence was louder than any argument she could have raised. Gasps and murmurs rippled across the seats. The passengers could feel it. This was no ordinary situation. Something about Coco's presence, her refusal to crumble, hinted at a truth that hadn't been revealed yet, a secret that made her stronger than she appeared. And as Coco's eyes remained steady, there was one thought quietly building, one the flight attendant had no idea was about to shatter her smug confidence. Because just a few rows away, someone very important was watching, and he was moments away from stepping in. Coco sat back in her seat, her face calm but her eyes sharper than ever. The ridicule had been loud enough for the entire cabin to hear, and whispers still buzzed among the passengers. She didn't raise her voice or cause a scene. Instead, she adjusted her posture, her silence holding more weight than any outburst. Then, with the faintest movement, she turned her head slightly and gave a quiet signal to the man seated just across the aisle, her husband. At first, no one noticed. He looked like any other well-dressed traveler absorbed in a tablet, his presence unassuming. But when he set the device down and rose from his seat, something shifted in the air. His movements were steady, confident, deliberate. He wasn't just another passenger. He carried himself with an authority that demanded attention before he even spoke. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Passengers leaned in, curious. The flight attendants who had mocked Coco froze in place as the man stepped into the aisle. His suit was crisp, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, sharp and calculating, locked onto the staff. That's when the murmurs began to change tone, from gossip to recognition. Some passengers realized exactly who he was. The husband of the woman they had mocked wasn't just anyone. He was the CEO of the very airline they were working for. The realization spread like wildfire, and within seconds the attendants who had ridiculed Coco were standing stiff, their earlier arrogance draining from their faces. Their panic was written in every twitch of their hands and nervous glance. He didn't shout, he didn't need to. His presence alone silenced the chaos. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but carried the weight of final judgment. He asked for the names of the attendants involved, his words slow, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. The tone wasn't one of anger, it was worse. It was the tone of a man who held absolute power over their future and who had just witnessed their biggest mistake. Passengers sat stunned, their eyes darting between Coco and her husband. Every word he spoke hinted at what was coming, and everyone knew it wasn't going to end well for the staff. They shifted nervously, apologizing quickly, stumbling over excuses. But each excuse fell flat. He wasn't swayed. He wasn't here for apologies. He was here for accountability. The staff's fear only grew as he leaned in slightly, telling them this incident would not be overlooked. There would be consequences, not just for their behavior, but for the culture they thought they could hide behind. He didn't raise his voice, but the quiet promise of action struck harder than any outburst could. All around them, passengers sat in stunned silence, some even recording on their phones, realizing they were witnessing a story that would be talked about for years. And while the attendants trembled, Coco remained composed, her dignity intact, watching as her husband turned humiliation into justice with nothing more than his presence and his authority. The tension in the cabin was suffocating, but beneath it all lay the question no one dared to say out loud: what exact punishment was coming, and how far would the CEO go to make sure this moment was never repeated? That uncertainty hung in the air, pulling every passenger deeper into the unfolding drama. The moment her husband revealed his authority as the airline's CEO, the energy in the cabin shifted instantly. The flight attendant who had mocked Coco froze in place, her confidence draining away. Her posture stiffened, and she tried to hide behind a forced smile, but the room was already watching her unravel. The captain had been alerted, senior staff rushed forward, and the authority that seemed untouchable in her hands was now crumbling in front of everyone. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, whispers spreading like wildfire. A murmur of disbelief ran through the first-class cabin. People were realizing they had witnessed not just cruelty, but arrogance directed at the wife of the man who ran the entire airline. The shame on the staff's faces was undeniable, but the silence from the CEO made it even heavier. He didn't need to raise his voice, his very presence demanded accountability. And everyone wondered, what would his next words decide? The flight attendant tried to explain herself, stuttering about misunderstandings and procedures, but the CEO raised a hand to stop her. His tone was calm yet final, the kind of voice that carried years of authority. He reminded the crew that customer service was not just policy, it was principle. And the principle had been broken in the most public and humiliating way. All eyes were on him, but more importantly, all eyes were on Coco, who sat quietly, her dignity fully restored. How far would this accountability go? The CEO instructed the purser to remove the offending attendant from first-class service immediately. Gasps rippled through the cabin as the uniformed staff escorted her away, her eyes darting nervously at the passengers who had witnessed her downfall. It was swift justice, and yet the tension grew because everyone knew this was only the beginning. If the CEO could take such decisive action mid-flight, what consequences awaited the staff once they landed? Passengers who had been silent before now spoke up. Some confirmed what they saw, voicing their disapproval. Others praised Coco for her composure, realizing her calm strength in the face of humiliation had been far more powerful than retaliation. The weight of the power shift was now clear. No longer were the passengers intimidated by staff authority. They were united in respect for Coco and in awe of her husband's command. But what punishment would ultimately fit the arrogance displayed in front of so many witnesses? For Coco, the emotional payback was subtle but profound. She didn't gloat, didn't raise her voice, and didn't need to. Her very calmness magnified the shame of those who had mocked her. The more she stayed dignified, the more the guilty staff shrank under the spotlight. Her authority was no longer questioned, and her presence spoke volumes. Every passenger knew that this was not just a matter of service, it was a matter of respect, and Coco had earned it back in full. Yet everyone couldn't help but wonder, what decision would the CEO announce once the plane touched down? Would this incident remain confined to the cabin, or would it shake the entire airline to its core? Coco sat back in her seat, finally breathing freely. The storm that had started with humiliation had ended in a way that restored her dignity in front of everyone. She did not raise her voice, she did not let anger take control, yet she left no doubt about her worth. For Coco, this moment was not just about winning respect from strangers on a plane, it was about reminding herself of her own power. Her composure was her strength, and that strength silenced ignorance louder than any confrontation could. The lesson was clear to everyone watching. Respect is not optional, it is a necessity. Professionalism cannot be selective, and justice will always find its way when people try to belittle others. The flight attendant learned that arrogance comes with consequences, while the passengers witnessed how quickly the balance of power can shift when someone is underestimated. For Coco, the biggest victory was not in exposing the wrongdoing, but in proving that grace under fire carries the greatest influence. She knew this moment would not end here. Stories like this ripple outward, changing policies, shaping behavior, and reminding people in positions of service that every passenger, every individual, deserves dignity. As the plane continued on its journey, so too did the quiet echo of the lesson, one that would follow the airline long after Coco stepped off that flight. The rules of respect had been rewritten, and those who had witnessed it would never forget. In the end, this story reminds us that courage, discipline, and self-awareness command respect even in the most hostile environments. No one should ever be judged or belittled based on appearances, because behind every person may stand a story, a strength, or even a power that changes everything. But what Coco and her husband did next reshaped the airline completely, leaving a mark that no one could ignore. What would you have done if you were in Coco's place? Share your thoughts in the comments, and stay tuned because the next story will take this lesson to an even higher level.